Hi, I'm Sarah Bunin Benor, professor of Jewish Studies and Linguistics at Hebrew Union College.
We're going to get into all of your expertises, Jewish summer camp lingo, Jewish naming, Jewish pet naming. I want to start off with, how did you get interested in this stuff?
I play violin, and I started playing klezmer violin when I was in high school. And then when I got to college, I was looking through the course catalog at Columbia University, and I saw a class that mentioned klezmer music. It was about Yiddish culture, and so I decided to take that and got into Yiddish culture through that, and then did an internship at the Yiddish Book Center. And then when I was, I think I was a sophomore, I was reading an assignment for a class on Romance languages. I was clearly interested in languages. And I saw a mention of Judeo-Italian and Judeo-Portuguese, and I hadn't heard of those before. And I said, what? This is amazing. This is what I want to do with my life, study Jewish languages.
Okay, so I'm super excited because I assume everyone loves sociolinguistics, because who doesn't? I mean, in a sense, we're all amateur. There's no more fun conversation than what are people naming their kids, right?
And pets.
And pets. And we'll get to both that, which you actually study. And, you know, my brother has this conversation about how he didn't read, this is being a little unfair, but more or less he wasn't reading literary fiction until he was 18 or 20. He just read sci-fi and fantasy. And I think he did it with this mix of like pleasure but also guilt, because why wouldn't you spend all your life reading? It's so much fun. And I almost feel that way about talking about naming. Like it's the lingua franca. We all talk about it, and you got to study it. But I guess any of us could have studied it, right?
That's true.
You just had the wisdom to do it.
It is the most fun part of my job.
Do you think, how big is the community of people who do sort of Jewish sociolinguistics?
Pretty small.
I mean, it's you and how many other people? If you had a conference.
Yeah, I don't know, 2 dozen maybe.
2 dozen?
Yeah.
So, okay, so we're gonna start with stuff that's not in your scholarly wheelhouse at all, because I have you here.
Okay.
Okay, I'm Mark with a K.
Yeah.
Periodically, people will say to me, Jews will say, oh, you know, you have it the Christian way. And this drives me around the bend. This drives me insane. Mm-hmm. And there's a sense in which what they're not saying is the King James Bible translated Mark with a K, which would be an accurate thing to say. There's a way in which Christians learn to read Mark with a K. Mm-hmm. They're saying something deeper, which is that Jews like it with a C. Is there anything? Do you have any opinion on this at all?
Well, my husband is also named Mark with a K. And I don't think of K as a more Christian spelling than the C. I think of C as more French spelling.
That's how I think of it.
Yeah. So I'm assuming that the K is just from Germanic languages primarily, and I don't think that has more Christian connotations. But the fact that people think it does means that it does, right?
Right.
It's all socially constructed.
Right. There's some mid-century bit of Jewish humor. I think it's some comedy record that was made or something, or maybe it's a Tom Lehrer song or something that makes a joke about Jews spelling like Linda with a Y.
Oh.
Or do you know what I'm talking
No,
about?
I haven't heard that one.
I'll try to find it, but it was basically saying, it was kind of, you know, circa Goodbye Columbus, or and the joke was, you know, that Jews enjoyed like throwing a Y in where Gentiles would just use the I, Linda with a Y or something. And
oh, that's interesting. I do know an Alan Sherman song about coming home from being a salesman and being greeted by all these Jews with distinctly Jewish names. And it's mostly last names, though.
Okay.
Most of the first names are not distinctively Jewish first names.
And were the last names Jewish last names or crypto-Jewish last names like Miller and Green?
No, they were mostly Ashkenazi Jewish names.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how many Jewish languages are there?
Well, it's just a really hard question to answer, because where do you divide between different dialects of a language? And like, are those considered separate languages? And then also, how do you decide which variants to consider? So I just don't have a number, but on the Jewish language website, I think we have something like 30 descriptions of something like 30 languages.
So the big ones a lot of people would know would be Hebrew and Yiddish. And then if you know a little bit more, you might know Ladino. Mm-hmm. What else? What would be the next flight of important ones to know? If you were to know 5 more, what would they be?
I'd say Judeo-Arabic, Jewish Neo-Aramaic, Judeo-Italian. It's just so hard to decide because there's so many,
Well, I
right?
mean, you're the expert. We're not going to call you on and say, I can't believe you left out, Judeo-Aboriginal Australian or something, right?
Bukharian, which is Judeo-Tajik.
Right.
Juhuri, spoken by the Jews in Azerbaijan and Dagestan. Judeo-Greek, I guess those are some of the important ones. Jewish Malayalam.
What's that?
Spoken in southern India by Jews in Cochin area.
Still?
There are very few left there. Most of them have moved to Israel, and it is maintained by the second generation in Israel.
Okay. So I assume a lot of these are on life support, or barely being spoken. Like 100 years from now, what's left if you had to predict?
Right. I would say Hebrew, modern Hebrew, and then the languages that have emerged in the last century or two, like Jewish English, Jewish Latin American Spanish, Jewish French, Jewish Hungarian, but all of the long-standing, and Yiddish.
Yiddish will still...
Oh, of course, yes.
Yeah.
So Yiddish is, thriving in Hasidic communities.
Right.
Ladino, in 100 years, there might be some people who are interested in Ladino and engage with it in post-vernacular ways,
right.
but it probably will not be transmitted intergenerationally. And same goes for Judeo-Arabic, Bukharian, Juhuri, etc.
Right. I mean, there's a point at which a lot of languages, if they're lucky, pass into classical languages like Latin and Greek, where they become Latin or ancient Greek, where they become classic languages that may not be spoken in the vernacular, but are given eternal life by people who love the classical literature or, people who enjoy studying it in the academy, right? I mean, that would be the hope for something like probably Ladino, honestly.
Ladino and Judeo-Arabic.
And Judeo-Arabic,
yeah, because
right.
there's a very large literature in Judeo-Arabic, mostly from the Middle Ages, but also periodicals from the 19th and 20th century in Judeo-Arabic, and Ladino also. So I think those two, and Bukharian has a substantial literature, Juhuri also some literature, Malayalam, Jewish Malayalam also.
That's the one in India.
In India, yeah.
So are they all versions of what I think of as Jewish English, which, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is basically English with a lot of loanwords from Yiddish and Russian and other languages that Orthodox Jews speak, that Haredi or ultra-Orthodox Jews often know, and they're bringing into the English that they know. Is that what's going on in Judeo-French as well? As these are French speakers in French-speaking lands, Canada, they're living in Montreal or Paris or whatever, but being that they are highly traditional Jews who also have a lot of Yiddish in their lives and Hebrew in their lives, they're bringing a lot of vocab.
Yes, but you said Yiddish and Russian in English, but I would say, yes, the Russian community does bring in some Russian, but in America, the Jews mostly use influences from Yiddish, from Hebrew, from Aramaic, but then there are also other communities that speak English, like in the Syrian Jewish community in Brooklyn, they use a lot of words from their Syrian Judeo-Arabic. And in France, I would say a majority of the Jews in France have descent from North Africa, and so they use words from their, Algerian Judeo-Arabic, their Tunisian Judeo-Arabic, Moroccan in their French. And so, yes, they're using words from Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic, not from Yiddish. But it's also more than just words, because when we think of Jewish English, often we think of things like staying by them, and I don't know from that, and also intonations, like if you've heard it, you know what I'm talking about, right? Or the Israeli hesitation marker, like,
yeah, the click,
exactly,
the click,
exactly, the click,
yeah. Okay, so let's click through a few of these. So I know where "staying by them" comes from. I mean, that's from German and Yiddish, which is
Yiddish, yeah.
It's from Yiddish. Yeah, it's also there in German.
Yeah.
It's the same word in German, which is it's like the French "chez." It's like at the house of.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's B-E-I or B. How would you do in Yiddish? B-E-Y? Would you translate it?
I would write B-A-Y.
B-A-Y.
But you could write
"Staying by them" is like, we'll be at their house, right?
Yeah.
And American non-Jews would never say we're going to stay by them or we're going to have Shabbos by them.
Unless they're influenced by German. In the Midwest, they might have that construction as well.
So let's do a couple others. I mean, one of the ones that I was raised to recognize, though no one in my family said this, but there was a sense that maybe relatives did, or that you knew someone was Jewish if they said this, is, well, I don't know from Scorsese films.
Yeah.
Why do Jews say I don't know from?
It's the same thing. It's based on the Yiddish construction, wissen von, like ich weiß nicht von dem. I don't know from it.
So it's a sort of a false translation. Not false, it's a translation. They've translated.
Yeah, it's just a loan translation, it's called. It's
Okay.
like the grammatical construction from one language is incorporated into another.
Okay. The click seems pretty new. I mean, I've been in kind of Jewish circles and journalism and scholarship for 25 years. I feel like 20 years ago, people didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
I've been asked a lot about it in the past 10 years.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Can you talk for people, and some people won't know what the heck we're talking about.
Okay.
What is this click? Describe it. Where does
Sure.
it come from? Who does it?
Yeah, so it's from modern Hebrew.
Okay.
It's used in Israel. In Israel, there are two different clicks. One is, which means no, and right, yeah, and it's like
No.
There's lip rounding, like that, but this one is. There's not lip rounding, and it's used as a hesitation marker, often in the middle of a sentence, like we were doing this, and then whatever, it doesn't matter.
Interesting.
So like a self-correction thing, but also used at the end of someone else's statement and to sort of disagree with it, like, no, it's not like that,
Interesting.
Anyway, it's very common in Israeli Hebrew, and it's very contagious. So people who've spent time in Israel and then come back to the United States or whatever country they live in,
Right.
often incorporate it into their English once they've encountered it in Israel. So it makes sense that Orthodox communities do this more than other communities because there is so much back and forth from Israel. And people spend time in yeshiva in Israel, like a gap year after high school, that kind of thing.
I was going to say, a place I almost ubiquitously see it is teenagers I've known who graduate from high school, go do a year in Israel, come back, and they're in college in America, and they have it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just Orthodox Jews. You hear this from non-Orthodox Jews who've spent time in Israel and then come back and it spreads.
And it spreads.
Yeah.
It's just so cool. It's so interesting. Here's one. My observation, and maybe you've written about this or other people have, I think I asked you about this once on my old podcast, is the 100%.
Oh, yeah.
Which I think is a Jewish thing. That a lot of Jews, to say they agree with you, they'll say, oh, 100%, 100%.
Yeah.
Any idea where that comes from?
No, I'm not sure. And it's not just Jews who do that, right? Some other people use that as an affirmative response.
Right.
But I do think it's more common in Orthodox communities and often without the 100%, 100%. And even saying it twice.
100%, 100%, yeah.
But I think that's one of these things that has just developed because Orthodox Jews have relatively insular communities, and things develop in language in insular communities, and not even just insular communities. In communities where people are in contact a lot, certain linguistic features develop.
Yeah. What is sociolinguistics?
The study of the relationship between language and society.
So a lot of linguistics, or classical linguistics, if my sense is, was more philology, was the history and development of words. Is that right? Or syntactical questions? I mean, Chomsky linguistics is like grammar, right? Is why do our sentences look the way they look?
Right. So a big question in early linguistic research was philology, like looking at ancient texts and figuring out how languages were related. Historical linguistics looks at the relationships among language, like in the Indo-European family, looking at the relationships among Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, and seeing how they're related and ultimately come from a common ancestor, Proto-Indo-European. Or you can do the same thing with Semitic languages like Amharic and Arabic and Aramaic and Hebrew, and seeing how they're related to each other. And then, Chomsky in linguistics is more interested in the mind and the grammar that's in your mind, so focusing a lot on syntax.
And then sociolinguistics is saying, why do people from a particular region talk this way, or a particular class, or a particular occupation, right? Is that?
Yeah, so modern sociolinguistics grew out of dialectology, looking at language variation and change. So that relationships among languages stems from the change in one particular language that makes it branch off into multiple languages. But even when it's still the same language, we see that languages are always changing. And so modern sociolinguistics grew out of people recognizing that languages are always changing, and that those changes result in different dialects and sociolects. So not just regional, but like you said, also socioeconomic and racial, ethnic, and gender, and all sorts of other social dimensions that correlate with distinctive linguistic features.
Right. So what's interesting about Jewish sociolinguistics, which I think is a relatively new field? I mean, you're kind of one of the first people to do it.
In the 70s and 80s, Jews scholars started to be interested in Jewish languages and focusing on the social elements of them.
Yeah.
So what's interesting about Jewish sociolinguistics?
Or what are the big questions? You know, I mean, I think of the classic sociolinguistic studies by people like Labov, and he was looking at oftentimes African-American dialects. He was looking at, you know, urban questions, class. You know, there were questions that were brought up by white urban ethnics and African Americans. What are the questions that are interesting about Jewish sociolinguistics?
Sure. So I think the same questions that Labov was asking, and he even did ask this about Jews as well. He does have some studies that include Jewish New Yorkers, and there are other studies, you know, in around that time that look at Jews in contrast to Irish and Italians. But I would say, A, how do Jews speak differently from non-Jews? And B, what does that say about their identity? How conscious are they of that? How do different Jews speak differently? And you know, I see this as a broader, I see this as part of a broader study of Jewish culture and society. And, you know, language is just one element, one dimension that Jews use to distinguish themselves, not only between Jews and non-Jews, but among different types of Jews. And so sometimes it's conscious, like thinking I'm going to say Passover instead of Pesach in this conversation, but sometimes it's less conscious, like having a little click here and there, or having something distinctive about their intonation, you know.
Where does that come from, by the way?
The intonation?
Yeah.
Well, it's influenced by Talmud study. In traditional Talmud study, Jews use their intonation patterns to indicate where the boundaries are in phrases in the Talmud, because there's no punctuation, right? And so traditionally this is done in a chant, like right? And then that gets transferred to conversations about the Talmud. So you're saying, well, first translations of the Talmud, like that's what this means and that's what this means. And then to conversations about the text, and then just to your everyday conversation. So whereas you might say, in your Talmud study, in your everyday conversation, it might be something more like this and then more like this. So you're like exaggerating the intonation contours of the phrases, and then that just becomes a feature of Ashkenazi Jewish speech in English.
And it's one that comes from the male community, which is not usually the rule. Isn't sociolinguistic progress, aren't usually women at the avant-garde, at the cutting edge?
You've read your Labov.
And they bring their stuff to men. And this is one that would have started in male spaces, and they brought it home to women.
Totally. That's a really good observation. And in Orthodox communities, you definitely see more distinctive intonation among men than among women. But you still see distinctive intonation among women, something like, if you're going to the store, get me some milk. You know, like a little less intensive of a chant. It's not really chanting. It's just a little bit more, a more distinctive contour.
And then, of course, there are people who probably self-consciously choose to try to lose it, right? To try to not have it. I mean, I remember having a conversation with a guy who's a big macher in Lakewood, this Haredi ultra-Orthodox community, who is a business person, a businessman, who does a lot of business with Gentiles, and the guy sounds like just your average American football coach. How are you? How the hell are you? Good to see you. Let me show you an apartment you might want to buy. There's no Jewish in it anywhere, just like broad American macho.
That's really interesting, but I bet when he's talking to his community members, he changes the way he talks. And so that's another big question of sociolinguistics and sociolinguistics of Jews as well, is how do people manipulate their speech? How do they change the way they talk to different audiences in different contexts about different subjects? And so, I looked at, and when I did my dissertation about how Jews who become Orthodox change the way they talk, I found something very interesting, that the same people were speaking very differently when speaking to what's called FFBs, which is Jews who are from birth. And
born Orthodox, basically, or born observant,
versus those who became Orthodox as adults, Balei Tshuva, right? And so those, I have recordings of a teacher giving the same lecture to a primarily FFB crowd versus a primarily Baal Tshuva crowd, and found that he completely changed the way he talked. He had so many more Hebrew, Yiddish, Aramaic words in his FFB-oriented speech than in the other.
Because he was being sensitive to the fact that they didn't know, that the Balei Tshuva didn't know these words, or might not know these words.
That's right. And he did use a lot of the words, but he translated them.
Right.
But then there were grammatical features that he used in the other one. I think people are pretty aware of the distinctive features of their language, especially those who are, who live in multiple worlds, who interact with people who grew up Orthodox and then also with people who didn't.
Does anyone not code switch? Are there people who don't have either the interest in or the talent for? I mean, I'm one of those people. I'm a mimic. I mean, I think it's all on a continuum. I unconsciously start sounding like them.
Okay.
Maybe it's the word choice, maybe it's the intonation, whatever. Are there people who don't do that at all?
I don't think so. I think everyone does it to some extent, but you're right that it exists on a continuum, and some people do it a lot and some people don't do it much. And there is definitely diversity in talent for code switching.
Mm-hmm.
And so I saw this when I was doing my research about Balei Tshuva. I found that some people are really talented at picking up this new way of speaking, but others have a lot of trouble. And some people intentionally don't want to sound like they grew up from. They want to sound like a Baal Tshuva, so they might even intentionally make mistakes, like saying Baal Tshuvas instead of Balei Tshuva.
Wait, they want to sound like they're newly observant.
Yeah, even if they've been observant for a while.
Why would there be any sort of like kavod in the community? Why would you have any extra respect for sounding newly observant? Wouldn't you always want to sound as if you'd been doing it for a long time? Why would you want to sound less talented at it?
Well, I think some people are very proud of their Baal Tshuva identity and want people to know through their language that that's who they are.
Wow.
Yeah, but that was rare. I mean, I think
rare.
I think most of the people I encountered were trying to sound more Orthodox and sound like they grew up Orthodox. But some people also avoided certain things, like some people avoided the by, saying staying by them. But some people said they avoided it, but then said it because it's just it's all around you, and it's hard not to say that.
Right. That one feels like a very far bridge. As someone who didn't grow up, who's not highly observant and doesn't live in those communities and didn't grow up like that, there are a lot of things that if I'm around people who talk in a certain way, I start talking like them.
Yeah.
It's very hard to imagine saying I'm going to stay by them for Pesach.
Yeah.
Like that's that's so deep in the Orthodox community, I think.
Right.
Okay, names. You've studied names a lot.
Okay.
What do we need to know about Jewish naming patterns? What's the story? What's the narrative there?
Well, how long do you have?
I mean, a while,
well, okay, so first I'll start with, are you talking about first names or family names or both?
Sarah, where do we want to start?
Okay, we'll start with family names.
It's all so interesting to me.
Right.
Okay.
We'll start with family names.
Okay.
So in family names, Jews around the world have commonalities and also differences. So around the world, you can find geographic names. So names from other places that indicate that their ancestors were from other places.
Pinsky, Minsky, Oppenheimer, right?
Yeah, that's right. But so you just mentioned a few Ashkenazi ones, but there are also a lot in Indian communities. For example, Rajpurkar is like a town in India that some Jews were from, and so people got that last name. Or in Iran, there's a lot of Tehrani and Dardashti. These are geographic names. And then So that's one category. Another category is occupation names. And these are also broader last name patterns, not just among Jews, right? So occupation names like names that non-Jews would also have those occupations, like Madar, which means, I think, potter in Yemen, or Miller, like you mentioned before, among Ashkenazi Jews. But then also some distinctively Jewish occupations, like Melamed, and meaning teacher,
right.
And let's see.
The wine-related ones, Geffen, Gaffney, right, where they make wine, they're vintners, I think, or kosher, kosher-coated wine.
Right, right, or Chazan, cantor.
Which then goes into chasen a lot in Los Angeles, for example.
Yes, that's right.
It was a big restaurant, right?
Yeah. And so, so occupation names. Then there are characteristic names, which is also a common category. So Klein and Gross, small and big. Some color names might be about characteristics, like Schwarz, meaning black, could mean that they just had dark hair or dark skin.
Right.
And
Schwartz, in other words, right.
And then but another characteristic is your Jewish caste. So Cohen and Levi, for example, are characteristics of that person, that they are descended from certain rabbis. And then one of my favorite categories is rabbinic acronym names in Ashkenazi communities. Braff, like Zach Braff.
Yeah.
He probably had an ancestor who was a rabbi named Pinchas, because it's Ben Rabbi Pinchas becomes Braff. It's like an acronym for Bet, Resh, Pei, right?
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Or Babed, which is Ben Av Beit Din, the son of the head of the rabbinical court.
Interesting.
So there are all these really cool patterns in naming. The most common names in Ashkenazi communities, though, don't fit into these categories. They're just what's called ornamental names. They sounded cool at the time. So Jews would have names like Rosenberg, Goldstein, Sternberg. What does that even mean? Star Hill.
Star Hill,
that doesn't make sense, right? And,
and Sternhell, Starlight, right? I mean, that's just pretty. Isn't Sternhell isn't hell light in German? Maybe. Or Sternlicht, it would be starlight, I think. Anyway, I mean, some of them are just...
Yeah, they just sounded cool.
Right.
And this was at a time when a lot of people needed to get names very quickly. So they would take a word from column A and a word from column B and combine them.
Right.
And so a lot of people think, oh, yes, I must be descended from somebody who, raised elephants because my name is Gelfand, which means elephant. No, it's just, it sounded cool. And that was like...
Is that what Gelfand means?
Yeah, it means elephant. Yeah.
So, obviously they weren't elephant trainers or something.
Exactly.
Or elephant importers or ivory poachers or something. That's so interesting, right?
Yeah, or like one of my family names is Silver. Doesn't mean that they were in the silver industry. It sounded cool.
It sounded ornamental and beautiful. And then when you get into Hebrew names like Benor, those were often just chosen, right? I mean, there was just, son of the light, right?
Yes,
I mean,
that was just changed from Bloom in 1948 in Jerusalem.
Right,
yeah.
Right. So there's a lot of that too. Okay, so first names.
Yes.
Okay.
First names.
Which in some ways I think is even more interesting because aside from the ones that are obviously biblical, they're all a little random. I mean, or there's a great deal of randomness, or it's a lot of it has to do with American traditions of naming and when you want it to sound more Jewish and less Jewish.
Yeah.
And, I mean, what's the story of Anglophone Jewish naming?
Right. So most Jews in America have names that are not distinctively Jewish. So, and that could include both names like Richard and Diane that are not related to anything biblical, and English versions of biblical characters like Sarah, Jacob, right? Some American Jews do have names that are distinctively Jewish, that are either Hebrew versions of biblical characters like Yaakov and Rivka, or modern Hebrew names and it could be, versions of biblical names like Avi, which is a version of Abraham, but also modern Hebrew, especially girls' names like Dahlia and Ariella, for example, to give two of my children's names. And then also some Yiddish names like Razel and Laser. And so the names that people choose for their babies correlates with who they want their children to be seen as and who they want themselves, who they see themselves as, right? And so I did a study of Jewish naming patterns that looked at correlations between the categories that people present themselves as and the names that they choose for their babies.
So what were your findings?
Well, that Orthodox Jews were much more likely than non-Orthodox Jews to use distinctively Jewish names, but that you also see correlations with time spent in Israel. If you spent more time in Israel, you're more likely to use a distinctively Jewish name. And also with their desire to have a unique name for their baby. But then also that there was a lot of change over time. So it seems that the late 60s, early 70s were a real dividing line, that before then, most Jews in America did not give their children distinctively Jewish names, but then there was a major increase in the early 70s.
Right, so there's that weird mid-century thing. The baby boomers were all, Judy, Carol, Diane. I mean, it's my mom and her cousins. It's Joanne, Judy, Linda, Barbara, Debbie, which is Jewish, but somehow felt very American. Debbie.
Right, and Judy too. I mean, it's from Judith,
I guess, but also there are probably a lot of Gentiles named Judy and Debbie, I'm guessing.
Exactly.
So it didn't feel Jewish, the way that Sarah might have, which I think was probably dipping down a little. Why Barbara, for example, was so popular among Jewish women in mid-century, I can only imagine that it just felt very bland.
And well, it's just because it was popular among non-Jews in mid-century.
Among non-Jews. And then, you start, I mean, I was born in 1974, and I feel like right around that time, I mean, I'm Mark, but my younger brothers are Daniel and Jonathan.
There you go.
And it seemed to be, and my sister's Rachel, so it seemed to be, it picked up, right?
Yes, exactly. In the 70s, and it wasn't just among Jews. So in the 70s, there was a new trend for English versions of biblical character names to become popular among Americans. So I was born in 75, and my parents said they didn't know anyone who was naming their kid Sarah, but it was one of the most popular names that year, right? And so that became really popular in the 70s and 80s. And Jews were actually, earlier in that trend because they had been using those biblical names all the time.
Right.
But then they used those more starting in those decades.
So where did names like Ari for the suburban American kid from Longmeadow, Massachusetts, whose parents had not been to Israel but once maybe, why is he Ari all of a sudden in 1977?
Right.
And why is his sister Jordana, which isn't even a name, which is like a river plus a feminine diminutive or something? There were these weird names that came in that didn't seem to be part of the parents' experience at all, and it was a few names that got very popular. Like, why were there so many Aris in 1977?
Well, that's a broader question about why names become popular in general.
Okay.
And they go in and out of fashion, and sometimes it has to do with some famous person who gave their kid that name, but sometimes it has to do with just sound patterns. Like in, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, there was a trend of the Jaden, Caden, Jason, Hayden, right? All these names that had similar sound patterns.
I think one of my daughters was in a class with 3 Jadens.
Oh, wow.
Maybe 4, one of whom was a girl, 3 of whom were boys. I mean, it was really interesting.
Yeah. And so that happens in the Jewish community too, where you get fashions, names going into fashion, and sometimes that is names that were their great-grandparents' names that are coming back into fashion, like Max and Henry, Rose and Pearl. But then sometimes it's just a little bit random, like that a certain name catches on and people hear someone in outside of their network, but they've heard of with that name, and then, oh, that's a cool name. I haven't heard of anyone among my friends with that name. But then gradually it becomes more popular in the community.
I mean, I've wondered that about Abigail as well, which got so taken over by everyone. I felt it feels less Jewish to me now because, first of all, it was weirdly popular among the Puritans as lots of Hebrew and Hebraic names were, but some more than others. And Abigail was very popular. And now it's just very popular among everyone. And I do feel like...
And Hannah.
Yeah, like everyone's naming their kid Hannah. Why all of a sudden does everyone get to use Hannah? That was a very Jewy name 25 years ago. And now it's...
Well, even the name Ezra, like I think of that as a very Jewish name, but now it's not. You know,
Yeah.
now you get
and
a
then
lot
they
of
don't
non-Jews.
know.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a Gentile friend who probably does know this because she's really down with the Jews, but she named her daughter Noah, N-O-A.
Oh, wow.
And I think she might know the Jewish, ancestry of that, the Jewish lineage of that, of the daughter of Tzlofahad. But there are a lot of Noahs, I think, who even in the Jewish community, where they don't know where it came from. It
Yeah.
just became a popular girl's name
That's
at
right.
some point.
Well, and because yes, it's biblical, but it wasn't used in Jewish communities until the modern Israeli era.
Right.
And that's another trend among Jewish names, to use names like Noah and Shoshana that do have biblical origins, but became popular in Israel in the 20th century. But American Jews are a little behind in their adoption of those names. And so now you get Americans using names like Shoshana, Noah, Talia, Eliza, that aren't popular among Israelis right now, but were a few decades ago.
So what's coming down the pike? What can we look over to Israel and see that is coming to America? Maybe you're not paying attention. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I think using boys' names as girls' names, using one-syllable names. I think you're seeing that a little bit
Tall.
now. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is hard to predict, and social scientists aren't supposed to make predictions. So I don't know.
Am I right that boys' names get taken over for girls, but it doesn't work in reverse?
That is the general trend, like Stacy, Hillary.
Well, there's all those British names, Evelyn, Lynn, Leslie, Stacy, Hillary, which were men's names that women felt free to take over.
Right.
But there aren't a lot of boys named Sue, right? I mean,
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's pretty unusual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's probably a kind of misogynist tinge to that, right?
Yeah,
Which is, it's cool for a girl to sound a little bit masculine, but for a boy to sound a little bit feminine, you're somehow disabling that child from the start, I would think.
I think you're right. Yeah.
All right, well, your most recent work is on pet naming, right? What's the study you're doing of Jews' names for their pets?
I realized that people are really excited about pet names. And so I decided to work on a non-academic book about Jewish names of pets. So Jews also, just like Jews tend to give their human babies names that are not distinctively Jewish, the same is true with pets. So most Jews give their pets names like Spot and Coco and Fluffy, right? But
in my case, our dog Minnie, whose real name is Minerva McGonagall Oppenheimer, after the character in Harry Potter. I did not choose it, but she actually came with that name, and we kept it.
Oh, wow. But Minnie could be seen as a Jewish name.
It could be, but if you talk to my children, who are very proud Jews with an interest in Jewish naming, they would say that in this case it's
not,
it's a
right.
a Hogwarts name. Yeah.
Well, actually, and that actually just gets at something that we didn't talk about, which is coded Jewish names.
Right.
That's another trend among American Jews, to use names like Amalia and Emmet and interpret them as Hebrew words.
Right. Oh, Emmet. I never thought of that one. Right? Truth.
Yeah, Emmet means truth, but it's just a name that doesn't have Hebrew origins, but when Jews use it for their babies, they often interpret it as a Hebrew word.
What are they interpreting Amalia as?
Work of God, Amal, yeah.
Oh, interesting. And it's not a biblical name. It's not.
No,
It's just
it's not.
Yeah, because there are a lot of Jewish Amalias
Right.
out there. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Oh,
Or Eliana.
Okay, what's with Eliana? There are 50,000 Elianas
Yeah.
right now under the age of 10. Do we have it's just a trend, we don't know where it comes from? It just.
Well, no, I mean, I think it's the same kind of thing. It's a name that comes probably from Romance languages into English, and it sounds pretty. It works with the sound patterns of and like having L sounds and the ah vowel and ending in an ah vowel, in an ah sound. But it also has the added benefit of having Eli Ana, my God answered. Right.
Oh,
and so
wow,
a lot of Jews interpret it as that Hebrew phrase, and a lot of Jews don't even realize that it's not originally a Hebrew name.
Right. Okay, back to the pets.
Yeah, back to
okay,
pets.
so back to so most Jews are giving their pets just Goyesha, boring, Scott, Kevin, Jane, whatever.
Oh, well, it's
Minnie.
interesting that you say that, because yes, but only since the 80s, that giving them human names. Because
right, before they were Spot and Fido and
exactly.
and
so now, yes, a lot of pets have human names, as like Billy and Joey and Bella, right?
Eliana.
Maybe. But a small percentage of Jews do give their pets distinctively Jewish names. Often named after historical figures. So there are a lot of animals named after Rashi. I know,
Yes.
7 dogs and 1 iguana.
Yeah.
And Rashi is not the only one, but there are other rabbis. I know some rabbits named Hillel and Shammai.
Menachem Mendel. I just made that up. I don't know.
Sure.
Right.
So historical figures, foods is huge. And these are broader American trends, right?
Yeah.
That Americans tend to use historical figures' names for their pets if they idolize that historical figure, but often using wordplay. Like, you get Julius Caesar and Rosa Parks.
Right.
But you also, and so then you get, let's see, there's Golda Meow.
But they don't really use the whole name then in that
Right,
case,
they'll
right?
call them Golda or Goldie.
In that case, what they're doing is making a joke for when they acquire the pet.
Yeah.
But then they call the cat Golda.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So historical figures is one trend. Another is food names. And so, you get all sorts of, like, what's a common name for a pet that's a food name? Like Peanut.
Okay.
Or, I don't know, Crackers or whatever.
Well, I'm always thinking of, didn't Adam Sandler famously name his dogs Matzo Ball and Meatball? Or
There you go. Yeah.
Do you know if am I getting that right? You don't know?
Certainly matzo ball. Yeah, I don't know about meatball.
There's matzo. There are 2 of them. There was matzo ball and something else,
I
and
don't know.
kugel or meatball or something.
Okay.
And I always think about that.
Yes, exactly. So that's pretty common to give your animals food names that are distinctively Jewish.
Okay.
Mostly Ashkenazi, but also some Sephardi. So you get babka, you get kugel, you get kishke, you get bamba.
Baba ganoush.
Maybe.
I don't know.
But then also boreka.
Right.
And, so there are certainly ways of identifying your family as being Ashkenazi or Sephardi and, being into this particular food with the name that you give to your pet.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's seen as a cute thing, right?
Do you have pets?
Yes, we have 1 dog, and her name is Libby, which I said to my daughter, you can get a dog, but you have to give it a Jewish name. And so she chose Libby, which means Libi, my heart,
Right,
in Hebrew, but also in Yiddish, Liebe, meaning love.
Got it. And that's your only pet?
Well, we had guinea pigs before, and they were Latka and Toffee.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, we went very, very Anglophile with our dog names. So we have Minerva McGonagall, and then we have Archie, who was named after the book designer Archibald Ferguson, whose book jackets I like. But I think one of the kids named him Archie, and I said, well, then he's Archibald Ferguson. I'm not sure how it happened, but we haven't. Our kids, in a couple cases, have very identifiably Jewish names, so we didn't do that. We didn't do that with the pets at all.
Well, yeah, so some people do the opposite. They'll give their kids names that are not identifiably Jewish, but then they choose very Jewish names for their pets, thinking that it won't be a handicap for them.
For the pet.
Right.
Is there anything we haven't talked about that you wish we'd talked about? Anything that you really love about your work, or that you love teaching to students, or that you hook them with in the intro lecture that we haven't gotten to?
Well, you did mention the summer camp thing that you wanted to
Oh, yeah. So you've studied Hebrew at summer camps, and they learn Hadar Ohel. They learned what is the story of Hebrew in American summer camps?
Right. So the story is similar to the part-time schools, where there are different goals for different settings, but most overnight Jewish summer camps are interested in fostering connection to Hebrew and making it fun rather than fostering proficiency in Hebrew.
I knew someone who went to Camp Ramah in the 60s who said that he finished a dozen summers at Camp Ramah basically speaking Hebrew.
Yeah.
Did it used to be much more intensive, Olpan-like, immersive than it is now?
It did, yes. And different Ramahs had different levels. Camp Ramah in Wisconsin still has more Hebrew than most of the other Ramah camps at this point. But yeah, they did, most of their activities were in Hebrew at that point. But the informal conversations were in English, even then. Right. And so it's definitely changed over time. But the Ramah camps in particular had this tension all along between immersion and infusion. Like, do they want the kids to be immersed in Hebrew, or do they want Hebrew to be infused into the camp, but to have higher level conversations about, theology and philosophy?
Right. All right, Professor Sarah Bunin Benor, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great talking to you.
This is great.
This is awesome.